one thing that we do know is that a murmuration happens because the starlings are communicating with one another and protecting each other. And so regardless of how mundane your day-to-day life might be, I think that by participating in a group and by impacting the 4 or 5 people around you, we become something that is even more powerful and more beautiful than we ever could have been on our own.
What if this is all just a dream?
Hi, my name is Michael Thompson. I am a visual artist and poet, as well as an educator based in Cincinnati, Ohio. My work primarily focuses on human ecology, understanding the ways that we interact with our environments on a day-to-day basis, as well as trying to find connections in different stories that are part of our day-to-day lives as well as part of our history. And as part of the Truth and Healing Artist Showcase, I created a piece titled Murmurations, which is comparing and contrasting different systems of movement in nature, as well as the power of collective action in our communities. My piece in the showcase is titled Murmurations, which is the title of a large flock of starlings as they move throughout the sky. And the reason that a murmuration happens is because starlings will come together to protect themselves and to communicate. And so the piece is about collective action and drawing comparisons between natural systems of movement and patterns in nature with the way that we move as a society. And in a murmuration, a starling will directly impact the 4 or 5 birds around it. And through influencing and reacting to the birds directly in its vicinity, these massive, beautiful shapes are formed in the sky through just a singular action happening over and over again. And so I wanted to use these really beautiful natural systems of movement as a metaphor for the individual and specifically for myself as an artist and the way that we can affect our society and affect the world and our communities simply by having an impact on a few people around us and in our local communities. It means a lot to me to be a recipient of the Black and Brown Artist Grant from ArtsWave and be in this Truth and Healing Showcase now for the 2nd year running. Last year, we had the opportunity to partner with Cincinnati Art Museum and this year with the Freedom Center. And as an artist who is really socially based, a lot of my work is community engagement involved or has to do with education and has a lot to do with social and political conversations going on locally and at a national scale. To be able to, one, collaborate with prominent institutions in our city who also have a focus on social justice in the community means a lot to me. To give my work a space to live that's accessible to the public and specifically to my city, but also that has a national ranking and a national reach. It's really great to be in a space that was just ranked the #1 history museum in the nation and to be able to show work that I think has themes which speak to some of our national crises at the moment. At the same time, to be part of a cohort of artists who I really respect and who we all have very different styles of work, but to be able to be in a similar space with them and to see the ways that our work has conversations with one another and overall kind of speaks to a larger dialogue is really powerful. So I'm very thankful to ArtsWave for providing me this opportunity and really allowing the city to see my work at a larger scale. So when I started to conceptualize the piece, thinking about rebirth, reconnection, and healing in our communities, I think space is one of the greatest things that we have that allows us to reconnect with one another and to have conversations. We need to have infrastructure to be able to even be in the common space, to be in this space right now and having this conversation. And when I think about space, I try to consider all of the different qualities, which of those are inviting to us, which of those bring us peace, which of those force us to challenge ourselves in the way that we might consider our individual views on something, and also that are hopefully going to allow us to interact with beauty in a way that is more nuanced and interesting. And to me, nature is obviously kind of the most beautiful and purest form of space that we can interact with, and that speaks to not only our senses, but our souls. And whenever I'm creating a piece, I always try to have some themes that are challenging the way that you think about the world, that you think about your communities, but I also want there to be an entry point. And if anyone is going to engage with my work, they need to have access to it first. If it's so esoteric that nobody can feel like they connect with it at all in the first place, then the challenging themes are never going to get to the people that need to receive them. So by taking something as simple as a bird, as a starling, and grabbing your attention with the scale of the piece, with my different painting and lighting techniques, and hopefully grabbing your attention in the first place, you'll be drawn in to the work. And then as you sit with the piece and hopefully interact with it and think about it and maybe come back to it, then you can consider the ways in which maybe the starling reflects you. This very common bird that in and of itself is maybe a very mundane animal, but when working in a collective is grandiose and gorgeous and beautiful and attention capturing. And specifically, like I talked about earlier, by impacting a couple people directly around us, I think that with our national politics, with social media, with a lot of the things that we see on the news cycle every day, with mass incarceration and murder that we see day after day on the news, it's very disheartening and often despairing to try and create work maybe that is inspiring or that you feel really has an impact. And so at the same time that I have been seeing all of these really troubling themes and events that are happening in the world and in our nation, I'm simultaneously really inspired by the people who are directly around me, both the artists and social servants and people in the city, the people that I work with on an everyday basis. Those are the people that inspire me to continue to do the work that I do, and that really give me hope for a positive future for the city and for our nation. And I wanted to make a piece that not only speaks to collective action on a national scale, but also really honors the people who are putting in the difficult work day after day and who have really embraced me and allowed me to continue to create art that I think is meaningful and hopefully has an impact on other people. So every time I'm taking on a piece, as an oil painter, it's obviously one of the oldest mediums and one of the most traditional mediums. And so if I'm doing something in oil paint, I want to challenge myself to push that medium in a way that it hasn't been pushed before. Innovation is a huge part of my work process, and I feel every time that I embark on a project, it kind of inherently creates a lot of problems that by solving them create a lot of new interesting solutions and tools and techniques, etc. So the piece itself is 16 feet by 9 feet. It's oil painting on canvas, but rather than being a traditionally stretched canvas that you might see like in Michael's or hung in most gallery spaces, it's instead kind of hung in a tapestry style. So there's two 16-foot beams at the top and the bottom that hold it in place, because I couldn't have any cross beams or supports in it because I created a lighting track that goes behind it. The canvas is gessoed with a clear gesso, which for those of you who aren't familiar with art supplies is basically like a substance that you put on a canvas to make sure that it holds the paint correctly and also doesn't disintegrate over time. So there's a clear gesso to allow for some transparency, and then multiple layers of very thin applied oil paint. And so I kind of thought about the process in reverse rather than the ways that you would traditionally do in oil painting, which is start very thin and build up really thick layers over time. I had to think about what are the lightest parts of this painting going to be, and where do I need to leave negative space. So the lighting track goes in line with where the thinner applications of paint are. And when turned on, those pieces really glow and create very bright spots in the canvas to kind of reinforce some of the lighter parts of the composition. And then I went over that with multiple layers of other paint and dark black gesso to block out and make different parts of it opaque. The composition shows an individual who is falling backwards while also being scooped into a crowd of starlings, into a murmuration as they fly off into the distance. And the individual is falling backwards, but there are different kind of iterations of the face that are moving forwards towards the starlings. So there's a push and pull effect that's going on with the composition of falling backwards while also moving forwards. There is a starling that the individual is gripping that kind of looks like it's escaping while also looking like it's being captured. And the arms of the individual kind of create a 90-degree angle while there's some geometric kind of sine wave shapes in the background that reflect some of the shapes that are formed in the murmuration. And I wanted to create a kind of a loop with the composition. So as your eyes move with the eyes of the individual, and as they move into the background with the starlings, it pushes you back into one another. And so your eyes kind of weave in and out of the piece. I'm really looking forward to kind of pushing this even more. This is my largest piece I've created, and it's also the first time that I've used these different lighting techniques. And I'm really excited to kind of continue in that path. It was very experimental, but oftentimes I think the best work is created when you're taking risk in that way. So the color scheme of the piece is a orange and blue kind of limited color scheme with complementary tones, and then some purples and greens kind of thrown in. But the figure in the painting is blue. One, because I really love using kind of arbitrary colors. It's very interesting to me. I think it also kind of speaks to just the multiplicity of beautiful skin tones of everyone who is going to interact with the piece. And I want at least some people to be able to project that imagery on themselves. Again, kind of to get back to access points, I want my piece to be accessible to all people, even though I'm obviously creating from the perspective of an African-American male. But from a practical perspective, I am very colorblind. I mix up most colors, and specifically any tones that are like neutral value tones are really difficult for me to kind of perceive and also to mix those colors properly. And specifically when I'm dealing with skin tones as well, I find it very hard to see kind of the undertones in skin. And so I can't mix those colors up accurately most of the time. And so when I'm working specifically on a scale this large where I kind of have to remix paint colors over and over to get batches that are big enough to cover something of that scale, I find it really useful to use complementary tones and use very high contrast and to use arbitrary colors when creating, because it allows me to see my own work better and to get to some of the subtleties and details that a lot of times when I've tried to paint with like realistic skin tones or natural tones in nature, I'll come back 2 days after I painted something and I won't be able to see something that I painted before because the tones are so similar. So it's a color scheme that you'll probably see reappearing in a lot of my work. If you look at some of my older work, you'll see a lot of complementary tones, a lot of very high contrast, a lot of geometric and dynamic compositions that allow my eyes to work better as I'm painting. I'm a muralist as well as being a fine artist. I was an athlete in a former life, and I'm very much about the connection between our mind and our soul and our spirituality and our bodies. I think that those two things go hand in hand, and to try and disconnect them would be to do a disservice to ourselves. And so as I'm creating, specifically as I'm creating something that is really meaningful to me and something that is going on over time, I love to use my body in a way that emphasizes like the paint strokes, in a way that I can feel a connection between the mental inspiration that's going on, as well as the way that I'm feeling my muscles working with my mind. There's definitely a mind-body connection there. So partially that's the reason why I work on such a large scale. I get to use the larger axes of my arm to paint larger shapes. And also I'll listen to a lot of jazz and hip hop, anything with really a strong bass line as I'm painting. And I find that it creates almost like a metronome, that as I'm moving my body, there is a cohesiveness between the final product and the process that's really important to me. Whenever I start a project, I almost always have at least some concept already in mind before I ever even apply to a grant. But because I already have so many ideas brewing, and being a poet, I write down and document a lot of my thoughts and ideas. So, like I said, with this piece, I was thinking about like natural systems of movement in nature, and I was thinking about collective action, and these were things that I knew I wanted to marry in some way. And when I received the grant, then I realized, okay, now I have the capabilities to create on a scale that I want to, and now I can put some direction to my concepts in a way that feels more realistic, and I can kind of see the end goal of what this might turn out to be. So I'll always do lots of renditions, smaller renditions of a sketch, and I allow myself to be very free in that process. I do a lot of research and consuming of media and being in nature and trying to experience the thing authentically that I'm going to create. And so I do a lot of that. I write about it a lot. And then I start to do different renditions of the sketch until I figure out what are the main shapes here? How are they interacting? Is it dynamic? Does it say what I want it to say? And then at that point, I'll do my initial sketch on a canvas or panel, whatever I'm working on. And then I lay out the big shapes, but I allow it to evolve over time. So I don't want to marry myself too much to an idea or even a color scheme from the get-go, because a lot of the times I find that translating something that is 5 inches to something that's 16 feet doesn't work 100% of the time if you don't have some flexibility in that process. Because the theme of the show is truth and healing, if I'm going to consider what my truth is that is expressed through the piece, I think it is a synergy. I think as a multimedia artist working in a lot of different areas, that's something that I seek after. I seek after collaboration, but also as an individual in my personal life, and with the people that I love, that I connect with, I collaborate with. The thing that I'm always looking for is how can I connect these two things that seem maybe totally opposite of one another, and how can I be the person or create the thing that ties these two things together. I think that we compartmentalize a lot of different parts of our life, of our profession, and I believe that my job as an artist is to get rid of those compartments and instead find ways where I can create common goals. And I think that Murmurations is at least a starting point to have that conversation, and hopefully allows other people to connect different parts of their lives that they feel are maybe very polar at the moment. I think if I want the viewers to walk away with one thing from this conversation and one thing from the piece, if you get the opportunity to see it, is that you are extremely powerful as an individual, that you have a massive capacity to change your community and to change the world, regardless of what your profession is, regardless of where you're at in life. I think if you are a motivational speaker, or if you're a stay-at-home mom, those things both have a massive impact purely by the way that you interact with the people in your space. And regardless of where you're sharing space, if it's in a public sphere, if it's in a classroom, if it's with your peers or authorities, if you show up to that space authentically and you try to impact in a positive way those that you're interacting with on a moment-to-moment basis, I think that is how we're going to change the world. One of the really cool things about a murmuration and about a starling is that they are the only bird in nature, and in fact the only animal in nature that moves in these patterns. And murmuration is specific to a starling, and it describes the undulating forms that we see as the birds kind of expand and contract and create different levels of density in the sky as they're moving. And a starling in and of itself is a very common bird. It's something that we might not take a second chance to look at every day. But when they are moving in packs, they become these astounding pieces of nature that totally perplex even scientists who aren't entirely sure how they work. One thing that we do know is that a murmuration happens because the starlings are communicating with one another and protecting each other. And so regardless of how mundane your day-to-day life might be, I think that by participating in a group and by impacting the 4 or 5 people around you, we become something that is even more powerful and more beautiful than we ever could have been on our own. The reason that I even found out about murmurations or came to learn about them is, one, that every time I've ever seen one walking throughout the city or just sitting in traffic, they've always perplexed me, that I've stopped in my tracks and looked up at the sky to see these beautiful birds as they move. And so it's something that has intrigued me my entire life. But as I began studying different systems of movement in nature, I found out that these were the only birds that did that. In fact, every time I ever saw that, these were starlings, and kind of sent me down a rabbit hole of researching how and why they moved and watching hours of murmurations in different regions of the country. But I'm kind of a collector as an artist. I'm like an archivist. I take little bits and pieces of my life, whether it's a piece of poetry or a piece of art or a quote from somebody or something that I found in nature. And I collect all of these things, and then when it's time to create, I can pull little tidbits out of my bag of tricks. And as I kind of catalog all those things, I find that some natural connections are made over time just by paying attention to the things that I see value and beauty in.
Just a dream.